All right,
Imagine
diving
being
in
on
today,
death row
folks.
for over
We're
20
going deep
years,
beyond the
convicted of killing your
surface
daughter.
into a
But
case
then new
that
evidence
really
comes out and
makes you
suggests
think,
that the science they used
about
to put you
justice,
away,
about our system, about
well,
right and wrong,
it might be totally
wrongful
wrong.
convictions. It's a heavy
That's the
topic, but a vital
situation
one.
facing Robert
welcome
Roberson,
to Convicted of Murder but
an
Innocent.
autistic father
This is
from
where
Texas who
this
was
is where we
convicted
take
of
these
killing his
stories, the
2-year-old daughter
wrongfully
Nikki
convicted,
back
the
in
fight for freedom, the
2002.
truth, and we lay it all
And today
out.
we're
This
going
is
to do
a
a
deep
dive
into
into his
case, an
case.
example
We're
of
going to be
injustice
looking at this
that'll
controversial
really make you
shaken baby
question
syndrome
everything you thought you knew
diagnosis.
about
We're also
the
going to be
system.
exploring how
It's
bias
powerful
may
stuff.
have
It is,
played a role
and
in
if
his
this kind of
conviction.
topic, this
And we'll
fight
also
for
be
justice,
looking
for
at
truth,
this new
that
evidence
resonates
that
with
has
you, there's a
emerged.
whole
Organizations
community
like
out
the
there
Innocence
waiting
Project are actually
at
fighting to get him a new trial.
https://10url.com,
So could it be that
Comedy
an outdated
Podcast
scientific
More
theory
info,
and maybe
ways
some
to get involved.
bias? Could that have led to this incredibly serious miscarriage of justice?
Yeah, it's a really interesting case that really makes you think about how our understanding of science, especially in the courtroom, it can evolve so much over time.
Right, and how much those changes can affect people's lives. Like sometimes the consequences are just life-altering. So let's start with the basics of the case. What happened on January 31st, 2002 in Palestine, Texas?
Well, that's the day that Robertson's daughter, Nikki Curtis, she passed away. She was only 2 years old, and she'd had a fever, and she'd been acting really lethargic. And then at some point, Nikki just stopped breathing. And Robertson, he rushed her to the hospital, but she didn't make it.
So just an absolute nightmare for a parent. What happened after that? Did the doctor suspect something right away?
They did. They saw bleeding in the brain swelling, and bleeding in the eyes. So based on these 3 symptoms, they suspected abuse and diagnosed Nikki with shaken baby syndrome. But, this diagnosis, it was pretty new at the time. And the medical community was still trying to figure out exactly what it was.
And that's where things get a little more complicated, right? Because now we know that those symptoms don't always mean that a baby was shaken.
That's exactly right. We now know that infections, genetic disorders, even accidents, those can all cause the same symptoms as shaken baby syndrome. And sadly, this wasn't really explored that much at Robertson's trial.
Okay, so we already have one potential red flag with the diagnosis itself. But was there anything else that might have influenced how investigators viewed Robertson?
Well, you have to remember that Robertson is autistic. And because of that, he didn't really react to this crisis in the way that people might normally expect. He didn't really fit that kind of picture we have in our minds of a grieving father.
I see, and especially back then. Autism wasn't as widely understood. I can see how that would be misinterpreted. It's just heartbreaking to think that a father who's already going through so much pain, he might have been even more misunderstood because of something he has absolutely no control over.
Yeah, and raises the question of whether that lack of understanding about autism, whether that contributed to some bias during the investigation, and maybe even during the jury's decision.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and that's something we're going to keep digging into. So he gets convicted, and now here we are, over 20 years later. What happened next?
Well, he's been on death row all this time, but there is some hope because new medical evidence has come out, and it could potentially change everything.
And that's where organizations like the Innocence Project are so important, right? They've been involved in a lot of these cases where new evidence challenges an old conviction. But for those who might not know, could you just quickly explain what the Innocence Project is and how they got involved with Robertson's case?
Sure. They're this nonprofit legal organization, and they work really hard to exonerate people who have been wrongly convicted. And they do that mostly through DNA testing and legal advocacy. And they've had a ton of success. They've helped free hundreds of people who were in prison when they shouldn't have been. And in Robertson's case, they're really working to get this new medical evidence out there. They're trying to get his conviction re-examined.
So what does this new evidence show? Could it actually clear Robertson's name?
Well, the new evidence is suggesting that Nikki's death, it might have been caused by some kind of undiagnosed medical condition, maybe like a metabolic disorder, or even a blood clotting issue. And that obviously raises some serious doubts about the original shaken baby syndrome diagnosis. It's possible that something else entirely caused her death.
Wow, that is a huge development. If this new evidence is as strong as it seems, could this actually lead to a new trial for Robertson?
That's what everyone's hoping for. Robertson's legal team and the Innocence Project, they really believe that this new information, combined with what we now know about autism, they believe it's strong enough to warrant a new trial. They want to show that the original trial was flawed because of that outdated science and because of that lack of understanding about autism.
It really makes you think, how many other cases out there? How many other cases might be relying on outdated science? And how can we, as a society, make sure our justice system keeps up with scientific advancements? We have to prevent these potential miscarriages of justice from happening again.
These are really important questions that this case brings up. We're going to dig into those a bit later. But first, I think we should take a closer look at the science behind shaken baby syndrome. How has our understanding of this diagnosis changed over time? And what were some of the key turning points that led to this shift in perspective?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's fascinating how something we once thought was scientific fact, how that can be reinterpreted so drastically. It makes you wonder about how solid some of these convictions actually are.
It really is amazing how medical knowledge changes over time. What we used to think was a clear sign of shaken baby syndrome, that triad of symptoms. Well, now we look at it much differently. Some people are even skeptical of the whole diagnosis.
So how did that change in thinking happen?
Well, one of the biggest things was realizing that bleeding in the brain, brain swelling, and bleeding in the eyes, those three classic signs, they can actually be caused by a lot of other things. As medical technology and research got better, we started to realize that those symptoms could be caused by infections or genetic conditions or metabolic disorders, sometimes even just from short falls.
So a kid falls off the couch, and that could look like shaken baby syndrome.
Yes, sometimes.
Yeah.
And that was a big deal. It made the medical community really rethink things. Doctors and researchers started to question if you could really diagnose shaken baby syndrome just based on those symptoms.
And I bet that had a huge impact on legal cases, especially the ones that were based on that diagnosis.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This new understanding of shaken baby syndrome made people question whether some of those convictions were actually right, like in Robertson's case. Maybe there were other explanations for the child's injuries that weren't even considered at the time.
It's like the legal system was working with old information, and that had these huge consequences for people's lives.
That's a really important point. The legal system needs to have rules and follow procedures. That's how we make sure things are fair and consistent. But sometimes that means the law doesn't keep up with science. We have to make sure that legal cases are using the most up-to-date scientific knowledge. That's the only way to make sure that justice is really being served.
It's kind of like what happened with DNA evidence, right? That totally changed forensic science. And so many people were freed because of it.
That's a great comparison. It shows how important it is for science to always keep pushing forward. And the legal system has to be willing to use that new knowledge, even if it means looking at old cases again and maybe even changing past decisions.
This is all really eye-opening, but it also makes me wonder, what can we do to make sure this doesn't keep happening? How do we make sure the justice system keeps up with new scientific discoveries?
That's the big question, isn't it? And there's not an easy answer. But there are a few important things we can do. First, we need scientists and legal professionals to talk to each other more. They need to share their knowledge and work together. Judges and lawyers need to learn about the latest scientific developments, especially in areas that are important for legal cases.
So we need to break down the walls between science and the law and encourage them to work together.
Exactly. And we also need to be more careful about the scientific evidence that's used in court. We need to make sure it's really reliable and accurate, and that it's based on the most recent understanding.
It sounds like we need to be just as critical of scientific evidence as we are of any other kind of evidence.
And absolutely. If we just accept scientific claims without thinking critically, especially if those claims are old or controversial, well, that can have terrible consequences. And it's not just about the science itself. We also need to be really aware of how bias can affect the legal system, especially bias against people with disabilities like autism.
That's a really important point. We have to address those biases and make sure that everyone is treated fairly in the legal system, no matter what their differences or diagnoses are.
You're absolutely right. And it's not just about the legal system. It's about how we think as a society. The more we learn about autism and other disabilities, the better we'll be able to understand how people communicate and react, especially when they're under stress. That understanding can help us be more empathetic and informed citizens.
It's all about challenging our own assumptions and biases. We need to step back and ask ourselves, am I really understanding this situation? Or am I letting my own limited understanding get in the way? Am I letting stereotypes and prejudices cloud my judgment?
Those are really powerful questions. And they're questions we should be asking ourselves all the time, not just in legal cases, but in all parts of our lives.
This deep dive into Robert Roberson's case has really shown us how complicated the justice system can be, and all the ways that things can go wrong. But it's also shown us how important the Innocence Project is, and all the work they do to help people who have been wrongly convicted.
Their work is so important. They're not just fighting for individuals. They're fighting for a system that's more fair and just for everyone. They're showing us the problems and pushing for real change.
It's really inspiring, and it reminds us that we can all do something to make the system better. It feels like this case really raises some big questions about how we balance justice with the fact that science is always evolving. But even with all these complexities, it seems like there's still some hope for Robertson. What are the next steps in his case, and what can people do if they want to support him and his fight for a new trial?
Well, right now, Robertson's lawyers and the Innocence Project, they're working on presenting all this new medical evidence to the court. They're trying to build a case that shows the original conviction might have been wrong. They're focusing on the possibility of a misdiagnosis, and they're pointing out how people might have misunderstood Robertson's actions because he's autistic.
So they're saying that if we look at this case again, now that we know more about the medical science and about autism, there's a good chance the outcome could be different.
Exactly. They want to help Robertson get his freedom. But they also want to set a precedent for how the justice system handles cases like this. Cases where new scientific discoveries change what we thought we knew.
It's about making sure everyone gets a fair chance. No matter what their differences or diagnoses are, everyone deserves access to the most up-to-date scientific understanding.
Right. It's about recognizing that justice is a process. We should always be willing to re-examine old cases, especially when we have new information or a better understanding of people.
So what can our listeners do if they want to help with Robertson's case? Or if they want to be part of this bigger conversation about reforming the justice system?
Honestly, I think the most important thing is awareness. Sharing Robertson's story, talking about these issues with friends and family, even just discussing it online, all of that helps to give him a voice. And it puts pressure on the legal system to do something. There's a lot of power in collective action.
Social media can be so powerful for that kind of thing, raising awareness and getting people involved. But are there any organizations people can support directly?
Yeah, for sure. Organizations like the Innocence Project really depend on people's support. Donations, even small ones, can really make a difference. They help them provide legal expertise and resources to people like Robertson. And of course, volunteering your time and skills is a huge help too.
It's a good reminder that even little things can add up and make a real difference. We can all be a part of making the justice system more fair and more responsive to new scientific discoveries.
I think one of the most important things we can take away from all of this is that we need to be willing to question our own assumptions. We need to learn about things we don't understand. And we need to fight for a world where everyone is treated fairly and with dignity, no matter how they're different.
Well said. This deep dive into Robert Robertson's case has been really thought-provoking. It's shown us how the justice system can make mistakes, but it's also shown us how dedicated some people are to making things right. It's a story that reminds us that every voice matters. We all have a role to play in making sure justice is served. And the search for truth is a journey that never ends. Thanks for joining us. And a big thank you to all our listeners for tuning in. We encourage you to learn more about Robertson's case. Keep talking about justice reform. And remember, even small actions can lead to big changes. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.